There is a tablet in the British Museum that the gods try to destroy, not metaphorically, not symbolically. The gods in the story recorded on that tablet, the actual divine characters whose words were pressed into wet clay by a scribe in the ancient city of Sippar sometime around 1635 BC, specifically attempted on 3 separate occasions to eliminate the very beings whose nature they found unmanageable. The tablet itself, catalogued as BM 78941, measures roughly 25 centimetres long and just over 19 centimetres wide. It is a fragment, the bottom half of a 3-tablet set, and its surface is chipped, its edges worn, its text interrupted in places by the accidents of 4,000 years of burial. But what survived is enough. What survived is, in some ways, the oldest written argument about human nature that the world possesses. Wherever you are listening to this tonight, whether the window beside you shows a city still lit or a darkness settling over fields, whether you are somewhere familiar or somewhere far from home, take a moment before we go further. Leave a comment, if you like, telling us where you are. There is something quietly remarkable about people in entirely different places listening together to words pressed into clay by someone who died 4 millennia ago. It seems fitting, somehow, given what those words are about. The tablet records a problem, not a battle, not a royal genealogy, not a trade agreement. A problem. The text, known today as the Atrahasis epic, describes a moment when the chief god Enlil, ruler of wind and storm and the higher authority over creation, turned to his divine assembly and made a statement that scholars have been debating ever since. The noise of humanity, he said, has become too great. He could not rest. Something about them disturbed him at a fundamental level, and he wanted it stopped. What followed, according to the clay, was a sequence of attempted remedies: plague, drought, famine. Each one was designed to reduce humanity to something quieter, something more manageable, something that would stop producing whatever quality it was that Enlil found so intolerable. And each time, one of the other gods, the god Enki, the god of wisdom and deep water, intervened quietly on the side of the humans, not through confrontation, but through instruction, through the transmission of knowledge, through a word in the right ear at the right moment. The flood came last, and even that did not fully resolve the problem. This is not a story most people hear framed quite this way. The Atrahasis epic is usually taught as a flood narrative, a precursor to Noah, a piece of comparative mythology, an illustration of Mesopotamian religious thought. But there is another way to sit with it. There is another question the text keeps pressing, almost involuntarily, from beneath its surface. Why was it so difficult? Why did it take plague, drought, famine, and a catastrophic flood just to address whatever quality the gods found uncontrollable in human beings? And why, even after all of that, does the text record that the solution was not elimination, but adjustment, that the gods ultimately had to learn to live alongside the very nature they had tried to suppress? The Sumerians wrote that question down. They preserved it on clay. They copied it, generation after generation, into new tablets when old ones crumbled. And that is only the beginning of what they preserved, because the Atrahasis epic is not the only text in which this pattern appears. Across legal codes and lament poetry, across creation myths and governance epics, across the hymns of the world's first named author and the oldest wisdom literature yet discovered, a consistent shape emerges from the cuneiform. Not a conspiracy, not an agenda, just a pattern, quiet, persistent, and older than any other written record on earth. Something about certain human beings, the text suggests, could never be made fully compliant, and the Sumerians, who built the first cities and invented writing and gave us the earliest laws, seemed to know this. They wrote it down, they pressed it into clay, they left it for whoever came after. Tonight, we go looking for what they recorded. The land between two rivers. To understand what the Sumerian records say about human resistance, It helps to first understand what the Sumerians were, not as a romantic abstraction, but as a specific people in a specific geography at a specific moment in the long unfolding of human civilization. The picture that emerges from archaeology is both more precise and more strange than popular accounts usually suggest. The Sumerians occupied the southern half of what is now Iraq, in a region the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers. Those rivers were the Tigris and the Euphrates, and they created, in an otherwise arid landscape, a ribbon of extraordinary fertility. The silt they deposited over millennia was among the richest agricultural soil in the ancient world. But that same flatness that made the soil productive also meant the region had almost no natural resources beyond mud and water. No stone, no timber, no metal. Everything the Sumerians built, they built from the one material the land gave them in abundance: clay. This turns out to matter enormously for what they left behind. Other ancient civilizations built in stone, and their monuments, though durable, required expensive specialized labor and tended to serve the state and the temple. The Sumerians, because they built and wrote in clay, created records of extraordinary breadth. A palace scribe, recording the delivery of wool to a weaving workshop, used the same material as a temple priest composing a hymn to Inanna, a merchant tracking the interest on a grain loan, a schoolboy practicing his signs, a physician recording a medical procedure, a mother mourning a lost city. All of them pressed marks into wet clay, and all of those marks, if the clay was fired, or if it happened to survive in damp-proof storage, endured. The British Museum alone holds approximately 130,000 cuneiform tablets. The Penn Museum in Philadelphia holds tens of thousands more. The Louvre, the Istanbul Museum of the Ancient Orient, the Ashmolean at Oxford, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, together the surviving corpus of cuneiform writing runs to hundreds of thousands of individual documents spanning more than 3,000 years of continuous use. Cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script pressed into clay with a cut reed, was not deciphered until the mid-19th century, a process of scholarly detective work that unfolded over several decades and involved competing claims from multiple researchers. Henry Rawlinson, an English soldier stationed in what is now Iran, painstakingly copied the trilingual inscription at Behistun between 1835 and 1847, suspended on ropes high on a cliff face, working from the Old Persian version of the text toward its Babylonian counterpart. In Ireland, Edward Hincks was simultaneously working from a different angle, analysing the syllabic structure of the script. Jules Oppert in France contributed crucial insights into the Sumerian language itself, which was neither Semitic nor Indo-European. A linguistic isolate with no known relatives, its grammar operating on principles entirely unlike those of any other ancient language. When, in 1857, the Royal Asiatic Society asked 4 scholars independently to translate the same passage of Akkadian cuneiform and found their versions substantially in agreement, it marked the effective confirmation of the decipherment. What followed was one of the more disorienting experiences in the history of scholarship. As texts began to be translated and published throughout the latter half of the 19th century and into the 20th, researchers found themselves confronting a civilization of staggering sophistication that had been almost entirely unknown. Sumerian mathematical texts revealed a numerical system based on 60, the sexagesimal system, that still governs our measurement of time and angles. Medical texts listed specific herbal remedies with careful dosing instructions. Astronomical records tracked the movements of celestial bodies with enough precision to allow modern scholars to verify their dates. Agricultural texts described irrigation techniques, soil management, and crop rotation. Legal codes established protections for individuals that would not reappear in the historical record for centuries after Sumer's collapse. The conventional scholarly framework dates Sumerian civilization from roughly 3500 BC, when the earliest recognizable writing appears at the site of ancient Uruk. Through the fall of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, around 2004 BC, though Sumerian culture and literature continued to be studied and transmitted well into the 2nd millennium BC. This spans, at minimum, 1500 years of documented continuous civilization, though the Sumerian king list, the Weld Blundell Prism, catalogue number WB444, currently held at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, pushes the conceptual horizon considerably further back. The prism, a baked clay column roughly 20 centimetres high, with 4 inscribed faces, lists kings who reigned before a great flood for periods ranging into tens of thousands of years. The numbers have puzzled scholars since the prism's publication, and mainstream Sumerology generally reads the pre-flood reign lengths as either mythological inflation or as a misunderstood numerical system. What is beyond dispute is that the Sumerians themselves believed their civilization had roots that extended far beyond what any surviving physical evidence could confirm, that they were, in some sense, preservers and restorers of something older rather than pure inventors of something new. Samuel Noah Kramer, the 20th century's most influential Sumerian scholar, spent decades translating and analysing the literary corpus housed at Penn and other institutions. His 1956 book, later republished as History Begins at Sumer, catalogued nearly 40 areas of human experience, education, law, medicine, philosophy, literature, cosmology, for which the earliest written records came from Sumerian clay. The list included things you might expect: the first legal codes, the first schools, the first libraries, and things that might surprise you. The first recorded lullaby, the first love song, the first recorded argument between a man and his wife, the first written description of a social reformer, and, as Kramer noted with some quiet astonishment, the first recorded case of what he called a man and his God, an individual human being lodging a formal complaint against the divine authority responsible for his suffering, appealing not to submission but to the relationship itself as a basis for demanding better treatment. That last entry in Kramer's catalogue is worth dwelling on. The existence of a formal literary tradition for individual complaint against divine injustice implies something about the Sumerian understanding of the human-divine relationship. It implies that the individual human being was understood to have standing, that their grievance was legitimate enough to be articulated, preserved, and copied, that the gods could be addressed not merely in hymns of praise, but in something closer to protest. The Sumerians who made those clay tablets knew something about how the relationship between authority and individual actually worked. They had cities to run, canals to maintain, harvests to organise, and legal disputes to resolve. They were, by any measure, among the most sophisticated administrators in the ancient world, and the records they left behind suggest that their sophistication extended beyond bureaucracy. It extended to a careful, curious, and sometimes unsettling honesty about the nature of the beings who made it all possible. The question the Atrahasis tablet raises is not, when you look at the full corpus, an isolated anomaly. It is a thread, and if you follow it carefully through the clay, it leads somewhere worth going. The ones who dug the canals. Before there were human beings, according to the Atrahasis epic, the gods did the work themselves. This is one of the strangest and most frequently overlooked details in the entire Sumerian literary corpus, and it appears in the very first column of the first tablet of the Atrahasis sequence, the opening frame of the story, before the creation of humanity, before the flood, before any of the events most readers come to the text expecting. The text states plainly, in the translation rendered by Assyriologist Stephanie Daly, when the gods, instead of man did the work, bore the loads, the gods' load was too great, the work too hard, the trouble too much. The gods, in other words, were labourers. Specifically, they were the gods known as the Igigi, the lesser divine beings, numbered sometimes at 300 or 700, depending on which passage you are reading, and their labour was not ceremonial. The cuneiform is specific about what they were doing. They were digging canals, they were clearing channels, they were moving earth. The text describes this work continuing for what it calls 3,600 years, a Sumerian great cycle, before the Igigi reached a breaking point. What happened next is recorded with a directness that still surprises first-time readers of the text. The Igigi stopped working. They burned their tools. They gathered outside the residence of Enlil at night, surrounding his dwelling in a posture that left no ambiguity about their intentions. Enlil, roused from sleep, sent his minister to ask who was at his gate. The reply, in Dali's translation, "Every single one of us gods has declared war." Enlil, the text records, wept. The god of wind and authority and the upper air, the ruler of the divine assembly, was moved to tears by the rebellion of his labour force. He called an emergency council. He consulted with the senior gods, Anu and Enki, and it was Enki, the god of wisdom, who proposed the solution, not a military response, not punishment, but creation. Make a new being, Enki suggested. Make a being from clay and the blood of a slaughtered god, and let this being carry the work the Igigi refused to continue. The god chosen for the sacrifice is named in the Atrahasis text as We-Ilah, a god. The text specifies who possessed intelligence, and it is his blood, his divine nature, his Itemu or ghost, that is mixed with clay to form the first human beings. The mother goddess Mami, also called Nintu or Ninmah, shapes them, and the text records her pronouncement with considerable precision. The new beings would bear the load. The new beings would carry the labour. The new beings would release the gods from the work the Igigi had refused. The mainstream scholarly interpretation of this passage, represented by scholars including Stephanie Dali, W.G. Lambert and Thorkild Jacobson, reads it primarily as a cosmogonic myth, an explanation of human origins and the purpose of human existence within a religious worldview that positions service to the gods as the central meaning of human life. This reading is well supported by the broader context of Mesopotamian religion, which consistently portrayed the gods as requiring human labour in the form of temple service, agricultural production, and the offering of food and care to divine statues. Humans exist in this framework because the gods needed someone to do the work. This is the mainstream view, and it deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms. It reflects a genuine theological position held by real people in real cities for real centuries. The temple economies of Sumer were not abstractions. They were functioning administrative systems in which the divine household was managed by priests and priestesses and workers who understood their labour as sacred service. The myth on this reading is the ideological foundation of an economic reality, but there is a detail in the creation account that mainstream interpretation sometimes moves past a little quickly, and it concerns what exactly was mixed into the clay. The text does not merely say that the blood of the slaughtered god was used. It says, and translators from Lambert to Dali agree on the substance of this, that what was preserved in the new being was the god's Itemu. This Akkadian term, often translated as spirit or ghost, designated in Mesopotamian religious, thought the animating essence of a being, specifically the quality that persisted after death, the part that could not simply be dissolved or discarded. It was, in a conceptual sense, the part of a god that remained recognisably godlike even when the body was destroyed. The humans were not made from clay alone, they were made from the imperishable remainder of a divine being. What this implies, and it is worth pausing on the word implies, because the text does not state it as a conclusion, is that the very material from which human beings were constructed included something that the gods themselves could not eliminate without eliminating the thing that made humans useful in the first place. The intelligence, the Itemu, the animating divine remainder, these were not accidental additions to the recipe. They were specifications, and specifications have consequences. Tikva Frymachenski, in her 1977 analysis of the Atrahasis epic published in the Biblical Archaeologist, was one of the first scholars to draw sustained attention to what she identified as the inherent contradiction built into the human creation formula. The gods needed beings capable enough to manage complex agricultural and hydraulic labour, beings who could dig canals, maintain irrigation systems, solve the practical problems that arise when you are managing water in an unpredictable floodplain. They needed, in other words, beings with genuine cognitive capacity. But beings with genuine cognitive capacity are not, by their nature, passive. Capability and compliance exist in tension. The very quality that made humans effective at the work also made them capable of something else entirely. Frymachenski stopped short of drawing explicit conclusions from this tension. She presented it as a structural feature of the myth, not a deliberate theological statement. And that restraint is appropriate. The text itself does not editorialize. But the pattern it establishes is not subtle. The gods created human beings by incorporating into them the intelligence of a divine being. They then found those human beings unruly. And the word the text uses for what specifically disturbed Enlil, what the noise actually was, has been the subject of genuine scholarly debate ever since. That debate is where the story gets even more interesting. The noise that disturbed heaven. The Akkadian word is rigmu. It appears repeatedly in the Atrahasis epic in connection with what the human beings were producing that so disturbed Enlil. The standard translations render it as noise or uproar or clamour, and on the surface this seems straightforward enough. The humans were loud, they had multiplied, there were too many of them, and they were making too much sound, and Enlil wanted quiet. This is, in fact, the dominant scholarly interpretation. W.G. Lambert and A.R.
Millard, who produced the landmark 1969 edition of the Atrahasis epic for Oxford University Press, read the noise passage primarily in demographic terms. Overpopulation was the problem, and the flood was the solution to that population pressure. Anne Drathcorn-Kilmer, in an influential 1972 paper in Orientalia, argued for an even more specific reading, that the rigmu referred specifically to the noise of overpopulation and its associated overcrowding, and that the entire flood narrative was, at one structural level, a myth about resource
management and divine concern for sustainable human numbers. Both readings are defensible, both are grounded in careful philological work, and both represent the kind of rigorous mainstream scholarship that has built the current understanding of Mesopotamian literature on solid foundations. But there is a problem. Several problems, actually. The first is that rigmu does not consistently mean only the noise of population in Akkadian usage. The word appears across a range of Akkadian texts, in contexts that include battle cries, the sound of divine proclamations, the voice of the storm, and, crucially, the sound of prayer and lamentation directed from humanity to the gods. When the texts describe the gods hearing the rigmu of suffering humanity, the word is doing something more complex than simply denoting volume. It encompasses the communicative intensity of human beings making themselves heard, the directed, purposeful sound of beings who have something to say and are saying it. The second problem is structural. If the concern was purely demographic, if Enlil simply needed fewer humans, then plague, drought and famine should have been sufficient. The text is explicit that each of these remedies worked in the immediate sense. The humans stopped multiplying so rapidly, they suffered, their numbers decreased. But the rigmu, in each case, resumed. The problem was not fixed by reducing the population. It came back, which suggests that what Enlil found intolerable was not simply a quantity of sound, but a quality of it, a property of human existence that reasserted itself regardless of how many humans were left alive. Frymachenski's 1977 paper in the Biblical Archaeologist was perhaps the most direct in confronting this tension. She argued that what the Atrahasis epic was ultimately wrestling with was not a noise problem in any acoustic sense, but a fundamental incompatibility between divine authority's need for predictable, controllable subjects and human nature's tendency toward autonomous vitality. The humans, she noted, were not described as disobedient in any explicit sense. They were not staging a rebellion. They were simply being, growing, working, loving, dying, and above all, making the particular kind of noise that living, feeling, thinking beings make when they exist in proximity to one another. And that particular noise, whatever its exact nature, was what Enlil could not tolerate. The academic debate over Rigmu has produced a genuinely interesting range of interpretations, and it is worth spending a moment with one of the more careful recent readings. In scholarship published in the 21st century, several researchers, working from the bilingual Sumerian Akkadian tradition and from parallel baby incantation texts, have noted that Rigmu in the atrahasis context appears alongside another word, huburu, which carries connotations, specifically associated with the energetic, purposeful sounds of active human life. Together, the two words seem to be painting a picture not of mere loudness, but of something closer to what we might describe as the hum of autonomous human activity, the ambient evidence of beings pursuing their own ends. This does not prove anything. The text does not say that Enlil was disturbed by human autonomy specifically. It says he was disturbed by their noise. But the word chosen, the structural pattern of the narrative, and the curious fact that no amount of reduction seemed to permanently resolve the problem, all of this invites a particular kind of attention. The Sumerians, after all, were precise people. They maintained some of the most detailed administrative records in the ancient world. They had words for specific quantities, specific grades of wool, specific categories of debt. They were not imprecise in their language by accident. When the scribes who composed and copied the Atrahasis epic chose Rigmu to describe what was bothering Enlil, they were making a deliberate linguistic choice. And Rigmu, in its full range of usage, described something that living, purposeful, communicative beings made when they were being most fully themselves. What Enlil could not sleep through, it seems, was not simply the sound of too many people. It was the sound of people who had not forgotten what they were made from. There is one more detail worth noting before we move to the next fragment of the record. After the flood, when Atrahasis has survived in his vessel and the waters have receded, the text records a negotiation between the gods. Enlil, furious that the human line has survived, confronts Enki. Enki defends his choice. And in the resolution that follows, which scholars debate in its particulars, the gods do not eliminate humanity, they modify the terms. They introduce mortality and infertility and infant mortality as limiting mechanisms. They adjust the conditions of existence rather than ending existence altogether. The modification does not include silencing the Rigmu. It could not. The noise was inherent. It came with the territory of the Atemu, the divine substance that had made humans capable of the work in the first place. You could limit the numbers. You could shorten the lives. But the quality itself, whatever it was, persisted. The Sumerians wrote this down, and then they wrote down something else in an entirely different genre that arrives at the same place from an entirely different direction, made from what could not be extinguished. The Atrahasis epic was not the only Sumerian text that described the creation of human beings, and the differences between the creation accounts are as revealing as the similarities. The text known as Enki and Ninmah, preserved in a composite edition drawn from multiple Nippur tablets, referenced in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature as ECSL 1.1.2, approaches the creation of humanity through an entirely different lens. Where the Atrahasis epic frames human origins in terms of labour replacement and divine need, Enki and Ninmah frames it as something closer to a philosophical contest between two divine intelligences. The result is a text that sits at the intersection of comedy and metaphysics, and which contains, embedded within its narrative, a quietly extraordinary claim about the nature of the beings that were created. The setting is a divine banquet. Enki and Ninmah, the god of wisdom and the mother goddess, are drinking beer together in the Abzu, Enki's subterranean freshwater domain. The wine, the text tells us, was sweet. The atmosphere was festive. And in this state of divine celebration, Ninmah proposed a challenge. She would create human beings from the clay of the earth, she declared, and whatever form they took, however imperfect, however unusual, Enki would find a place for them in the world, a purpose, a role, a means by which they could participate in the life of the community. What followed is one of the stranger passages in Sumerian literature. Ninmah, working with divine creativity and presumably a certain amount of wine, produced a series of human beings with unusual characteristics. A man who could not hold his hands straight, a woman who could not give birth, a being who could not hold urine, a person with clouded eyes, another with trembling limbs, another still who seemed incapable of sitting still. These were, in conventional terms, beings with disabilities, people who did not conform to the expected parameters of function. And for each one, the text records, Enki found a role. The man whose hands did not work correctly was made an official. The woman who could not give birth was given a place in the women's quarters. Each anomaly was accommodated, absorbed into the social fabric, given a purpose. The mainstream scholarly reading of this passage, developed in detail by scholars including Thorkild Jacobson and more recently by Gina Konstantopoulos, treats it as a myth of social inclusion, a theological statement that human diversity, even diversity that seems dysfunctional, has a place within a well-ordered society. Jacobson's translations of the passage emphasize the inventive social accommodation Enki performs, reading the text as an early articulation of the idea that community should encompass people who do not fit standard productive categories. This reading has considerable merit, but the text does not end there, and what happens next complicates the purely inclusive reading in interesting ways. After Enki has successfully found a place for all of Ninmah's unusual creations, the challenge reverses. It is now Enki's turn to create, and Ninmah's turn to find the purpose. Enki produces a being. The text at this point becomes partially fragmentary, which frustrates certainty, who seems to be in a completely ambiguous state. The being cannot eat, cannot walk properly, cannot stand or sit in expected ways. Its very existence seems to resist categorization. And the text records that Ninmah failed. She could not find a purpose for this being. She could not fit it into the ordered structure of the world. What to make of Enki's creation, the being that defeated the system of categorization, is genuinely debated. Some scholars read it as a figure for extreme disability or old age, a being so compromised in function that even a compassionate social order cannot accommodate it. Others, including more recent analysts working with the full cuneiform text, suggest that Enki's creation represents something else, a being whose nature actively resists the structure of purpose assignment altogether, a being whose existence is not organized around function in any way that Ninmah's framework could address. The specific Sumerian vocabulary used in the description of this ambiguous being is striking. Several lines use terms associated with liminality, with existing between categories rather than within them. The being is not simply dysfunctional. It seems to exist outside the coordinate system that Ninmah is using to evaluate and assign. The text does not moralize about this. It does not explain what the creation means. It records that Ninmah was defeated in the contest, that she could not categorize what Enki had made, and it leaves the implications open. But those implications are consistent with a pattern that appears across multiple Sumerian texts. The idea that within the range of human possibility, there are beings whose nature does not resolve into the categories that governing systems, even divinely ordained governing systems, are designed to process. The material from which humans were made, the clay, certainly, but also the divine remainder, the Atemu of Waila, mixed into the clay, carried within it something that resisted complete formalization. The Atrahasis epic describes the problem in terms of noise. Enki and Ninmar describes it in terms of a being that defeats the system of categorization. These are two different texts, two different genres, two different theological arguments, but they describe, from two different angles, the same underlying phenomenon. And then there is the physical description of the process in Enki and Ninmar that mainstream commentary sometimes treats as incidental, but which bears closer attention. The TECSL translation of the text records that after the creation of humans, Ninmar held up each new being and determined its fate. The verb used for this determination in Sumerian, namtar, is the same verb used throughout Sumerian literature for the assignment of destiny by the gods. But the text also records that the created beings were not simply passive recipients of this fate determination. They moved. They responded. They existed from the moment of creation in ways that their creators had not entirely anticipated. The divine remainder, it seems, had its own momentum. Whatever the gods built into the clay when they added the Atemu of We'ilah was not content to simply receive instruction. It had inclinations of its own. The one who would not obey death. Of all the figures in the Sumerian literary record who demonstrate what the texts preserve about uncontrollable human, or in this case divine human, nature, Inanna is the most relentlessly documented. The goddess Inanna occupies a position in the Sumerian pantheon that resists easy categorization. She is associated with love and war, with the morning star and the evening star, with abundance and destruction, with political authority and personal passion. She is, in scholarly assessments from Thorkild Jacobson's Treasures of Darkness to more recent feminist readings by Tikva Frey-Makensky and Betty Dishong-Mador, one of the most complex divine personalities in the ancient world. And the text that reveals her most completely is the one that puts her in the one situation where absolute authority should, by every structural logic, prevail, the realm of the dead. Inanna's descent to the nether world survives in multiple tablet copies. One of the oldest is the Old Babylonian tablet held in the British Museum, catalogued as Museum number 69737. A second early copy was excavated at the site of ancient Ur and is catalogued in scholarly literature as UX 619. The composite text was translated by Samuel Noah Kramer, who published the first modern scholarly edition, and subsequently by Diane Walkstein in collaboration with Kramer in their 1983 book Inanna, Queen of Heaven and Earth, which brought the text to a broader readership outside academic. Assyriology. The story begins with an inexplicable decision. Inanna, Queen of the Great Above, opens her ear to the Great Below. She abandons her temples, she abandons her divine offices, she puts on her regalia, her crown, her lapis lazuli measuring rod, her royal robe, her golden ring, her breastplate, and she descends voluntarily toward the realm of her sister Ereshkigal, Queen of the Dead, the place from which, as the text states plainly, no one returns. The mainstream scholarly interpretation of this descent has generated an extensive literature. Some scholars read it as a seasonal myth. Inanna's absence from the world above explains the withdrawal of fertility and abundance in winter. Others read it as a shamanic journey, a pattern of death and resurrection that served initiatory functions in Sumerian religious practice. Still others, following the psychological reading pioneered by scholars like Sylvia Brinton Pereira, read the descent as a map of interior transformation, a myth about the necessity of confronting darkness and dissolution before wholeness can be achieved. All of these readings illuminate genuine dimensions of the text. The seasonal interpretation has strong support in the agricultural anxieties that animated Sumerian religious life. The psychological reading captures something real about the myth's emotional structure. These are not wrong readings. They are, however, incomplete in ways that become visible when you read the text against the background of the other Sumerian records we have been examining. Because what is most striking about Inanna's descent, read in the context of Sumerian thinking about authority and control, is not that she went down, it is how she went down, and what happened when she got there. Inanna approaches the first of 7 gates to the underworld. She demands entry. The gatekeeper Neti goes to Ereshkigal, queen of the dead, to ask what to do. Ereshkigal's response is to allow entry, but on her terms, at each of the 7 gates, Inanna must remove a piece of her divine regalia. By the time Inanna reaches the throne room of the underworld, she has been stripped of every external marker of her power and status. She stands naked before the judges of the dead. And then something happens that has no precedent and no parallel in any other Sumerian narrative about the encounter between the living and the realm of the dead. Inanna refuses to submit to the final judgment. Naked, stripped of everything, standing before the absolute authority of death itself, she looks at Ereshkigal, and the look itself is described in the text as a weapon. The cuneiform uses the phrase the look of death, igihul, but it is Inanna using it, not Ereshkigal. Inanna, the naked prisoner in the court of her sister, issues a divine killing gaze. It does not save her. She dies anyway. The text records her death, and her body hung on a hook on the wall of the underworld. The forces of absolute authority win, in the short term, completely, but the text does not end there. Before descending, Inanna had instructed her faithful minister Ninshuba, if she did not return within 3 days, go to the gods and demand help. And so Ninshuba went to Enlil and then to Nanna, and both refused. It was Enki, always Enki, who found a way. He created 2 small beings from the dirt beneath his fingernail and sent them to the underworld with the food of life and the water of life, and Inanna was restored. The resurrection required a substitute. This is the part most commonly discussed. The rule of the underworld that demanded a soul in exchange for a soul. But what has received less attention is the structural fact that Inanna planned for this contingency before she even descended. She went knowing that the realm she was entering should have been inescapable. She went with a contingency plan for her own death. She went as someone who intended to return from a place explicitly described as having no returns. This is not simple obedience to fate. It is not acceptance of the limits imposed by the highest authority in existence, the authority of death itself. The Sumerian text preserves a figure who looked at absolute authority, stripped down to her most naked self, and still did not fully comply. She died. But she had already arranged for her death not to be final. Ereshkigal, the queen of the dead, the absolute sovereign of the realm that no one escapes, had to negotiate. The underworld, which defined itself by the rule that those who entered did not leave, had to make an exception. Not because Inanna was more powerful than death, the text makes clear she was not, but because she had not accepted the premise that the rule applied to her the way it applied to everyone else. The Sumerians preserved this story and copied it in tablet after tablet for centuries. They seem to have found it worth remembering. The question worth sitting with is, what exactly did they think they were preserving? What the gods left behind in the record room? There is a catalogue of divine powers in the Sumerian literary record that should, by rights, be better known than it is. The texts about the me, pronounced approximately May in reconstructed Sumerian, form a cluster of related compositions centered on the idea that civilization itself is made up of discrete, transferable powers. The me are typically translated as divine decrees or divine powers, though neither phrase fully captures what the Sumerian concept involved. Thorkild Jacobson, in his extensive analysis of the me in Treasures of Darkness, described them as something closer to the essential constitutive elements that make any given aspect of organised existence possible, the underlying patterns that, when present, allow specific forms of life and culture to function. The most famous of the me texts is the composition known as Inanna and Enki, preserved in ECSL 1.3.1 and reconstructed from multiple Nippur tablets. The text describes a banquet between Inanna and Enki in which, as the divine beer flowed and the gods drank in the sweetness of the moment, Enki began giving the me to Inanna. One by one, in a list that runs to more than 100 items in some reconstructions, he names them and she receives them. The cataloguing of what was given is one of the more remarkable passages in Sumerian literature. The list includes what you would expect, kingship, priesthood, the descent to the underworld, the ascent from the underworld. It includes specific craft skills, the craft of the smith, the art of the scribe, the craft of the carpenter. It includes social roles, the role of the priest, the role of the holy woman, the role of the ordinary priestess. But it also includes things that are considerably stranger and more philosophically charged. The art of lovemaking, the kissing of the phallus, the art of forthright speech, the art of slanderous speech, the art of dissent, the art of the troubled heart, the descent into the underworld, and, this is worth reading carefully, the art of the kindling of strife. Mainstream Sumerological interpretation, represented by scholars including Bent Auster and Samuel Kramer, reads the me list as a kind of inventory of civilization, a Sumerian theory of culture in which every meaningful aspect of organized human life is understood as a divine power that was, originally created and held by the gods, and then transmitted in various ways to human custody. The fact that the list includes destructive or morally complicated items alongside beneficial ones has been explained as Sumerian theological realism, an acknowledgement that a complete catalogue of what makes civilization possible cannot exclude its darker capacities, since those too are real and operating. This is a compelling reading. The Sumerians were, as their law codes and administrative records both testify, people who thought carefully about the full range of human social possibilities and tried to account for them systematically. A catalogue of civilization that included only the pleasant aspects would have been dishonest to the experience they were recording. But the structure of the me transmission narrative adds another layer that is worth examining. Enki does not consciously decide to give the me to Inanna. He gives them in a state of divine celebration, in the warmth of shared beer, in the looseness of a festive occasion. He gives what should, by the logic of divine hierarchy, remain in his custody and under his supervision. And when he sobers up and realizes what has happened, he sends his minister Isimud to retrieve them. The me, Enki decides, should not leave his domain. They do not come back. Inanna refuses to return them. She has received them legitimately, she argues. They were given to her freely. And the text records a series of pursuit and refusal that ends with Inanna successfully conveying the me to her city of Eridu and distributing them. The divine powers of civilization, including the troubled heart, the art of forthright speech, the descent to the underworld, the kindling of strife, are now in human custody, distributed through the city, embedded in the fabric of organised life. What this narrative preserves, reading it through the lens of the other Sumerian texts we have examined, is something like a creation account for the full range of human possibility, including the possibilities that make human beings difficult to govern. The art of forthright speech, which enables the direct articulation of complaints against authority. The troubled heart, which describes the inner state of one who will not simply accept what is given. The descent to the underworld, which the text elsewhere associates with Inanna's voluntary entry into the realm of absolute control. The kindling of strife, which is not celebrated, but is acknowledged as one of the me, one of the constitutive powers of organised human existence. These powers are not described in the me texts as unfortunate side effects of civilization. They are described as its substance. They are in the list alongside kingship and priesthood and craftsmanship, presented as equally fundamental to what makes organised human life possible. The question the text leaves open, and it is the kind of question that Sumerian literature consistently leaves open rather than resolving, is whether a civilization that holds the me, including the difficult ones, can be made to operate without those specific powers being present and active. The Sumerian records do not seem to think it can. The me are not sorted into desired and undesired categories. They are presented as a package, as a whole. Civilization, the texts suggest, comes with everything in the list. Everything. The king who said no. In 1943, the historian and Sumerologist Thorkild Jacobsen published a paper in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies that has been cited, debated, qualified, and returned to by scholars ever since. Its title was Primitive Democracy in Ancient Mesopotamia, and its central argument was that beneath the royal ideology of Sumerian kingship there survived traces of an earlier political tradition, a tradition in which decisions of community consequence were made by assembled citizens rather than by a single sovereign authority. Jacobsen's evidence came primarily from two sources: the Council of the Gods, as depicted in Sumerian mythology, where major decisions were made by divine assembly rather than unilaterally by a single deity, and the literary tradition of Sumerian city governance, where certain texts described human assemblies deliberating on matters of war and policy. He argued that the mythological pattern reflected a historical reality, that the divine assembly in the texts was a projection of actual human political practice, and that Sumerian communities had, at some early stage in their history, exercised collective decision making in ways that the later literature still preserved as memory, even as royal centralization accumulated. The paper's terminology has since been criticised. Primitive democracy carries evolutionary implications that modern scholars find problematic, but the underlying observation has held up substantially in the decades since Jacobsen's work. Multiple scholars, including more recent researchers whose work is compiled in Democracy in the Sumerian City-States published by ResearchGate, have confirmed that the evidence for deliberative assemblies in Sumerian political life is genuine and significant. The clearest literary example is the text known as Gilgamesh and Aga, preserved in composite form from multiple Old Babylonian tablets and referenced in the ETCSL as 1.8.1.01. One fragmentary version of this text is held at the Penn Museum, Philadelphia, identified as fragment 291684. The story it tells is compact, politically precise, and remarkable in what it reveals about Sumerian assumptions regarding the relationship between individual authority and community deliberation. Aga, king of Kish, sends envoys to Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, demanding submission. Kish was, at the time the events are set, the dominant city in Sumer, the first city listed in the Sumerian king list as holding kingship after the flood, a centre of power whose authority over the other cities of the region was a recognised political reality. Aga's demand was not, in the terms of the period, unreasonable. He held the senior kingship. He expected acknowledgement. Gilgamesh did not simply decide to refuse. He went to the assembly. The text distinguishes between two bodies of deliberation, the assembly of elders and the assembly of young men, the fighting men in essence, those who would bear the actual cost of war. Gilgamesh first presented the question to the elders of Uruk. Their answer was clear: submit. Kish is powerful. War is costly. Acknowledgement of Aga's authority is the wise course. Gilgamesh rejected this advice and went to the assembly of young men. Their answer was different: fight. Uruk would not bow. The city would stand. What Gilgamesh chose to do with these two competing deliberative outcomes is, in scholarly terms, the crux of the text. He sided with the fighting men. He sent back a refusal to Aga. The siege of Uruk followed. And in what seems to be an almost picaresque sequence of events, involving a captured scout who talks his way out of the situation by invoking Gilgamesh's name in front of Aga's face, the crisis resolved without full military conflict, with Aga ultimately releasing Uruk from submission. The mainstream reading of Gilgamesh and Aga developed by scholars including Jacobson himself, and more recently by scholars engaged with the political dimensions of Sumerian literature, treats it as a historical epic, a literary commemoration of an actual moment in the early history of Sumerian city-states when Uruk successfully asserted its independence from Kish's hegemony. On this reading, the assembly scenes are evidence of genuine political deliberation in early Sumerian governance, and the story's preservation reflects civic pride in a specific act of collective resistance. This reading has solid support, and it raises an important implication for our larger investigation. If the assembly scenes in Gilgamesh and Aga reflect actual Sumerian political practice, and the weight of scholarly opinion suggests they do, then Sumerian society embedded in its actual governmental structure a mechanism by which the population could resist the demands of superior external authority. The assembly of young men said no to submission. Their decision, and Gilgamesh's acceptance of it over the elders' contrary recommendation, drove the political outcome. But there is a further dimension that this reading, focused on historical reconstruction, sometimes does not fully develop. Consider what the text preserves in terms of the internal dynamic of the city. Gilgamesh is king. He goes to the assembly, but he does not simply accept its first answer. He goes to a second assembly when the first one does not give him what he wants. And it is the second assembly, the more junior one, the one without the institutional authority of the elder council, whose decision he follows. The text is not condemning this process. It is not presenting Gilgamesh's forum shopping as tyrannical or illegitimate. It is presenting it as how things work. The king consults multiple bodies of deliberation. The bodies give different answers. The king chooses the answer he wants to follow, and then the city lives with that choice. This is not pure democracy in any modern sense, but it is also not simple autocracy. It is something more complex and more interesting, a system in which the king's authority is real, but is also genuinely entangled with community deliberation in a way that cannot be cleanly separated. What the system preserves, embedded in its structure, is the reality that the community has a voice. The elders' answer could not simply be ignored. Gilgamesh went back to a different assembly rather than simply overriding the first. The young men's voice mattered enough to determine policy, and the outcome, Uruk's maintained independence, was, from the text's perspective, the right one. The refusal to submit is vindicated. The Sumerians preserved this story, copied it carefully onto tablet after tablet, and included it in their literary canon. They seem to have believed that the moment when Uruk said no to Kish was worth remembering. It was not simply a military victory they were preserving. It was a record of what it looked like when a community decided that its answer to superior authority was a refusal. The wisdom that walked beside kings. There is a tablet found near the ancient site of Abu Silabic, not far from Nippur in central Babylonia, that dates to approximately 2600 to 2500 BC. It is among the oldest literary compositions yet discovered anywhere in the world. Not a list, not an administrative record, not a temple inventory, but a literary text, a father speaking to his son. The text is known today as the Instructions of Shuruppak, catalogued in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature as the ISIL 5.6.1, and it represents a tradition of Sumerian wisdom literature that was copied and transmitted across centuries, surviving in versions from multiple periods. Shuruppak, in the Sumerian literary tradition, was a pre-flood city and its legendary king. The instructions he gives in the text are addressed to his son Ziusudra, the same Ziusudra who, in the Eridu Genesis and related texts, survived the Great Flood. The framing of the composition is therefore remarkable. This is wisdom transmitted from a world before the catastrophe, preserved through the catastrophe, and addressed to the one who would carry the knowledge forward into the world that came after. The content of the instructions is, on its surface, practical. Don't go surety for someone else's debt. Don't steal. Don't cut down trees in someone's garden without permission. Be careful about which woman you take as a wife. Choose your friends with discernment. Maintain good relations with your neighbours. Treat your servants fairly. These are the concerns of actual daily life, the practical wisdom of a civilization navigating the predictable challenges of agricultural community existence. The mainstream scholarly reading of the instructions, developed in detail by Bentauster, whose 1974 edition remains the standard scholarly reference, treats the text as an exemplary instance of the Mesopotamian wisdom tradition, a tradition that includes parallel texts from Egypt, Israel, and other ancient Near Eastern cultures, all of which share the basic format of an older authority passing practical and ethical guidance to a younger recipient. On this reading, the instructions are significant primarily as comparative material, evidence of widespread ancient traditions of formalized wisdom transmission, and as one of the earliest examples of a literary genre that would persist for millennia. This reading is accurate as far as it goes. The instructions do belong to a recognizable genre. The similarities between Shurupak's advice and later wisdom literature from other cultures are real and intellectually significant. But the specific content of certain passages in the instructions carries additional weight when read against the background of the other Sumerian texts in our investigation. Consider one of the most repeated emphases in the text, the extensive discussion of what Sumerian calls namzu, knowing, discernment, the quality of being able to read a situation accurately and respond appropriately rather than simply following prescribed behaviour. The instructions return to this quality repeatedly, in different formulations, as the most fundamental thing a person can possess. Do not speak arrogantly to your mother, that will make your mother's heart rejoice. One passage advises on its surface a simple social norm. But embedded within the formulation is the assumption that the son is capable of choosing how to speak, that he has the internal resources to modulate his behaviour based on understanding of consequences rather than simply following a rule. The instructions are not a rule book. They are, more precisely, a transmission of judgment, the effort to convey the capacity to navigate situations wisely rather than simply the correct behaviour for specific scenarios. This distinction matters enormously in the context of control. A person who behaves correctly because they have been given a rule and threatened with consequences for breaking it can be managed by the rule system and the threat system. A person who has been trained to exercise independent judgment, who navigates situations by understanding rather than by compliance, is a fundamentally different kind of person. You can adjust their rules. You cannot adjust their judgment from the outside. The instructions of Shurupak is specifically, deliberately, a transmission of the second kind of formation. Shurupak is not giving his son a list of commands. He is giving his son a mind capable of seeing what is actually happening in a situation and making wise choices within it. The text itself embodies the pedagogical philosophy it advocates. There is one more dimension of the instructions that connects directly to the pattern we have been tracing. The composition is framed as transgenerational transmission, wisdom passing from a pre-flood world through the catastrophe to the world after. In the Sumerian understanding, the flood was the greatest disruption in cosmic history, a moment when the gods attempted to reset the conditions of human existence. The wisdom literature tradition, by framing the instructions as pre-flood in origin and post-flood in reception, is making an implicit claim about the nature of the knowledge the text contains. It survived the flood, not because it was carried on a physical vessel, as the survivors of the flood carried their own lives and seed stocks and animal pairs, but because it was carried in a person, in Ziusudra, the son to whom Shurupak spoke. The wisdom is what the vessel actually preserved. The physical survival of Ziusudra was, in this reading, the mechanism by which a way of knowing, a faculty of independent judgment, was transmitted across the discontinuity of catastrophe. This is a subtle but significant statement about the nature of human knowledge. It cannot be eliminated by eliminating the conditions in which it was developed. It travels with the person, it arrives intact on the other side, and on the other side it begins again. The woman who wrote her own name. Around 2300 BC, in the city of a woman pressed her own name into clay. This is not unusual in the administrative records of ancient Sumer, where names appear constantly in accounts and receipts and contracts. What makes this particular act of naming unusual is that what the woman was writing was not a business record. It was a hymn, a poem, a theological argument so sophisticated that scholars are still unpacking its implications. And she signed it, not merely as a scribe, but as its author, as the creative intelligence responsible for what the text said and how it said it. Her name was Enheduanna. She was the high priestess of the moon god Nanna at and the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, one of the most powerful rulers of the ancient world, the man who had united Sumer and Akkad under a single imperial administration for the first time in history. She appears to have held her position for decades, bridging the cultural transition between Sumerian and Akkadian political power by serving as the ritual anchor connecting both traditions to the divine authority of the moon. The most famous of her surviving compositions is known as the Exaltation of Inanna, or by its Sumerian incipit as Ninmiara, Lady of All the Me. It survives in multiple tablet copies, including tablets held at the Penn Museum in Philadelphia. The disc of Enheduanna herself, a circular alabaster relief, approximately 25.6 centimetres in diameter, catalogued in the Penn Museum as object B16665, was excavated from the Gipar, the sacred dwelling of the high priestess at by Sir Leonard Woolley's expedition in the 1920s. It shows Enheduanna in a scene of ritual libation, accompanied by a small delegation of figures, and bears an inscription naming her. It is the only known ancient artwork that records both the name and image of the world's first named author. The circumstances under which Enheduanna composed the Exaltation of Inanna are described within the poem itself, a biographical transparency that has no parallel in ancient literature. During a period of political upheaval, a man named Lugalan seized power in Enheduanna was expelled from her position. She was forced into exile, removed from the temple, stripped of her ritual function, displaced from the city that was the centre of her life and authority. The text describes this experience in terms that are simultaneously personal and cosmic. Her exile is framed as the triumph of darkness over light, of Nanna over Inanna, of the moon god's quiet acceptance of her situation over the storm goddess's refusal. And what does Enheduanna do in exile? She writes. She composes the hymn that calls upon Inanna, the goddess of her devotion, not the god of her official role, to intervene. She constructs a theological argument for why Inanna's power should supersede the authority that has displaced her. She addresses the goddess directly, with a frankness that reads across 4,000 years as remarkable. I am Enheduanna, the high priestess. I carried the ritual basket, I sang the dirge of the gods. My god has not granted me my fate. The moon god has done something unsuitable. I will say to Inanna, the Holy One, the Queen of the gods, Anu has not granted you a superior position, but your own greatness has exceeded Anu's. This is not a conventional petition to a deity. It is a theological repositioning of divine authority itself. Enheduanna is arguing, in verse, in exile, stripped of her institutional position, that the power she was appealing to was not simply the power granted by the established hierarchy, but a power that exceeded the hierarchy. She was not working within the system to get the system to right her grievance. She was arguing that there was a higher authority than the system. The mainstream scholarly reading of Enheduanna's work, developed extensively by scholars including William Hallow, Joan Goodnick Westenholz, and more recently Sophus Hele in his 2023 comprehensive edition, emphasises the theological and political dimensions of her composition. The Exaltation of Inanna was not merely personal expression, it was a sophisticated instrument of religious politics, arguing for the elevation of Inanna as the supreme divine authority in a way that served the ideological project of Sargonic imperial integration. Enheduanna was a priestess and a politician, and her hymns served both functions. This reading is well supported and important. The political dimension of Enheduanna's work is real, but there is something in the biographical portion of the exaltation that exists independently of its political function and that connects to the pattern we have been tracing throughout this investigation. Enheduanna was displaced. The institutional authority that defined her role removed her from that role. She had, in the terms of her world, no official standing, no office, no recognised position from which to speak. She was in exile. She had lost in every external sense the markers of her identity and authority. She kept writing. The text she produced from exile argued, with theological precision and poetic force, for the legitimacy of an authority that had not been granted by the institutional hierarchy, an authority she claimed through her relationship with the divine, through the act of composition itself, through the fact that she could still think and speak and organise words into meaning. When the institutional structure removed her position, it found that it could not remove the thing that had given her position its actual content. The knowledge, the capacity for theological reasoning, the poetic intelligence, these had not been granted by Lugalan or by Nanna's temple hierarchy. They were hers in some way that institutional displacement could not touch. She eventually returned to Ur. The hymns she had written in exile survived for centuries, copied by scribes who had likely never heard of Lugalan and cared nothing for the specific political crisis that had generated it. What they copied, and why they kept copying it, was the poem, the argument, the record of what it sounded like when someone who had been removed from every institutional position she held still refused to stop speaking. The world's first named author turned out to be someone who could not be silenced by losing everything that gave her the right to speak. The Sumerians thought that was worth preserving, the law that protected the man with nothing. The oldest law code in the world was written by a Sumerian king who had recently come to power through military conquest, and it began, this is the detail that stops most modern readers cold, with a statement that he had established the law not for his own glory, but to prevent the strong from exploiting the weak. The Code of Ur-Nammu was composed during the reign of Ur-Nammu, founder of the third dynasty of Ur, sometime between approximately 2100 and 2050 BCA. The primary surviving tablets were excavated at the ancient sites of Nippur and Ur and are held in the Istanbul Museum of the Ancient Orient. Samuel Noah Kramer first translated the code in 1952, recognizing its significance as the earliest known legal compilation, predating the much more famous Code of Hammurabi by nearly 3 centuries. The prologue of the code is not simply bureaucratic formulation. It is a statement of purpose, and that statement is worth examining carefully. Ur-Nammu declares that he has established equity in the land and abolished the corruption, violence, and abuse that had previously characterized the administration of justice. He explicitly names the categories of people he intends to protect: the orphan, the widow, the poor man. He states that his laws are designed to prevent the man with 1 shekel from being taken advantage of by the man with 60 shekels, a ratio that expresses, in economic terms, the specific relationship between vulnerability and exploitation that the legal system was meant to interrupt. The mainstream scholarly understanding of the Code of Ur-Nammu, developed by Kramer and subsequently expanded by Pieter Steinkeller, Martha Roth, and other scholars in the field of ancient Near Eastern law, frames it as both an administrative instrument and a piece of royal ideology. On the administrative side, the code established specific penalties. Notably, the code imposes financial compensation for many offences that later codes, including Hammurabi's, would punish physically. If you injured someone, you paid a fixed amount of silver. On the ideological side, the prologue's declaration of protection for the vulnerable served the function of legitimizing Unamu's kingship by aligning it with divine justice. The king who protected the weak was the king endorsed by the gods. Both dimensions of this reading are accurate. The Code of Ur-Nammu was simultaneously functional law and royal self-presentation, and disentangling the two is probably not possible with the evidence available. But the structural choice embedded in the code is worth dwelling on regardless of its ideological motivations. The decision to write down specific fixed protections for individuals against the exercise of superior economic or political power, and to make those protections publicly accessible in the form of an inscribed text, created something that the act of inscription itself changed. Once the protection of the widow, the orphan and the poor man from exploitation was written down and posted, it became a reference point that could be invoked, a specific fixed standard against which actual behaviour could be measured, a record that existed independently of whatever the current power holder chose to do on any given day. This matters because one of the most effective tools of institutional control is the elimination of stable reference points. If the rules change with each authority holder, if no one can point to a fixed statement of what is protected, then every appeal against authority is inherently weak. The Code of Ur-Nammu, whatever its political motivations, created exactly the kind of fixed reference point that makes appeals against authority possible. It gave the man with 1 shekel something he could point to. The Code of Lipit Ishtar, composed approximately a century and a half later during the reign of Lipit Ishtar of Isin, extends this tradition in notable ways. The Lipit Ishtar tablets are held at the Penn Museum and date to approximately 1934 to 1924 BC. The code's prologue similarly invokes divine mandate and the protection of the vulnerable, but its specific provisions add dimensions that the Ur-Nammu code had not addressed. Lipit Ishtar's code includes protections against arbitrary seizure of property, provisions governing the rights of slaves who have served specific periods to gain freedom, protections for the children of secondary wives and concubines, and, in a passage that has attracted considerable scholarly attention, provisions governing what happens to property when family structures do not conform to expected norms. Martha Roth, whose 1997 compilation Law Collections from Mesopotamia and Asia Minor remains the standard scholarly reference for ancient Near Eastern legal texts, notes that the Sumerian law codes collectively represent a tradition of articulated legal protection that specifically addresses the exercise of power by the institutionally strong over the institutionally weak. The codes do not eliminate the power differential, they could not, and did not try to, but they insert between the powerful and the vulnerable a set of specified protections that the powerful are formally bound to respect. The cumulative effect of this legal tradition, when read against the background of the mythological and literary evidence we have been examining, is striking. The same civilization that recorded the gods' difficulty in managing human beings also systematically encoded protections for individual humans against the power of those above them in the social hierarchy. The same culture that preserved the story of Inanna's refusal to fully submit to the authority of death also created the world's first written legal protections for widows and orphans and poor men against exploitation by the wealthy and powerful. This is not a coincidence. It reflects a coherent, if never fully articulated, understanding of the relationship between authority and the individual, an understanding in which authority is real and legitimate, but is also subject to limits, and in which those limits exist not merely as courtesy or custom, but as inscribed, fixed, publicly accessible standards that can be invoked. The Sumerians, who invented writing partly to keep administrative records, used that same invention to record the limits of what authority was permitted to do. They seem to have understood, at some level, that the same capacity for language that made governance possible also made governance accountable. that writing things down created a reality that could not be entirely managed by whoever currently held power. The man with 1 shekel, standing before the man with 60, could point to the clay, when the cities burned and still they sang. In 2004 BC, the city of Ur fell. The third dynasty of Ur, the Ur III period, that had produced some of the most sophisticated administrative, literary and legal records in the ancient world, collapsed under pressure from the Amorites advancing from the west and the Elamites from the east. The last king of the dynasty, Ibbi-Sin, was taken captive to Elam. The great ziggurat of Ur, the city walls, the temples, the storehouses, the entire complex that had made Ur one of the most organised cities in the ancient world, all of it was left in ruins, looted, abandoned. The Sumerians responded to this catastrophe by writing a poem. More precisely, they wrote several poems. The tradition of Sumerian city laments, formal poetic compositions, mourning the destruction of sacred cities, includes 5 major surviving compositions. Laments for Ur, for Nippur, for Eridu, for Sumer and Ur together, and for the city of Agade. Of these, the lamentation over the destruction of Ur, catalogued in the ATCSL as Composition 2.2.2 and reconstructed from multiple Nippur tablets held in the collections of the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute, is the most extensively studied and perhaps the most remarkable. The lamentation was edited in its modern scholarly edition by Samuel Noah Kramer and more recently by Piotr Michalowski, whose 1989 monograph The Lamentation over the Destruction of Sumer and Ur, published by Eisenbrauns, remains the standard academic reference. The text runs to multiple stanzas, Kirigu and Sumerian, and is written in the voice of the city's divine patron, the goddess Ningal, appealing to the gods to spare the city, then witnessing and mourning its destruction when the divine decision to allow the catastrophe cannot be reversed. The mainstream scholarly reading of the Sumerian lament tradition, developed by Michalowski, Thorkild Jacobson, and more recently Greta van Bielaer, treats these compositions as liturgical texts, ritual laments performed at specific occasions, possibly at the restoration of destroyed temples, serving a communal function of processing collective grief and affirming the continuity of divine patronage despite catastrophe. The theological argument of the laments that the destruction of the city was a divinely ordained event that the patron goddess herself could not prevent, and that the same gods who decreed destruction would eventually decree restoration, served to explain disaster without undermining the fundamental framework of divine authority. Ur was destroyed not because the gods abandoned it permanently, but because the cosmic decision went against it for a time. This is a sophisticated and accurate reading of what the laments are doing theologically, and it captures something real about their function within Sumerian religious practice. But the laments do something else alongside their theological argument, something that is visible when you read the texts closely. They remember. With extraordinary specificity and detail, they describe what was destroyed. They list the temples, the sacred quarters, the specific locations within the city that were lost. They name the sounds that were silenced, the music, the voices, the particular quality of activity that had made the city a living place. They document the absence with a precision that goes far beyond what would be necessary for the theological argument alone. The lamentation for Ur describes, in careful detail, the moment when the storm god Enlil's decision against the city was made final. Ningal, the moon god's wife and the city's protector, pleads before the divine assembly. She argues. She makes the case for the city's continued existence. She invokes the city's past service to the gods, its faithful maintenance of the temples and rituals, its long history of compliance with divine expectation. The assembly does not change its decision. The destruction proceeds, and Ningal witnesses it, and the text records her witness. What is preserved in the lamentation is therefore not simply the theological framework that explains the loss. It is the record of Ningal's protest, her refusal to accept the decision silently, her insistence on making the case for the city even before an assembly that has already decided against it. The poem preserves the argument that failed. It keeps alive the voice that was not heard in time to prevent what happened. This is a remarkable thing to do with literature. It would have been theologically sufficient, and perhaps theologically more comfortable, to record only that the gods decided, the destruction came, and restoration will eventually follow. The lament tradition could have consisted simply of that theological arc. Instead, it preserves the objection. It gives space and careful poetic form to the complaint against what happened. And then the city rebuilt. New tablets were made. New scribes copied the old literature. The literary tradition, including the laments for the cities that had been destroyed, was transmitted forward into the new period. The cities that had burned continued to exist as remembered places in the literary consciousness of the culture that had survived them. The lament tradition ensured that even when physically ruined, could not be made to disappear. This is another form of the pattern we have been following. You can destroy a city. You can take its king captive. You can loot its temples and break its walls. What you cannot do, if the people who live there are still writing, is make it vanish from the record. The Sumerians preserved the memory of catastrophe with the same care they brought to the recording of prosperity. Both were worth writing down. Both were part of the truth of what had happened. And truth, pressed into clay, had a way of surviving things that the people who might have wanted to suppress it did not. The cities burned. The scribes kept writing. 3 ways to read the record. Across all the texts we have examined, the Atrahasis epic on its tablet in the British Museum, the creation myths from Nippur, the descent narrative of Inanna, the Me texts, the assembly poem of Gilgamesh, the wisdom of Shuruppak, the hymns of Enheduanna, the law, codes of Ornamu and Lipit Ishtar, the laments for the fallen cities, a pattern has emerged with a consistency that demands attention. The pattern is this: again and again, across different genres, different time periods, different theological frameworks, and different disciplinary purposes, the Sumerian records return to the same observation. Human beings, or the divine figures who function as their analogues and exemplars, possess a quality that resists complete institutional management. This quality is not framed as rebellion precisely. It is not celebrated as heroic defiance in any uncomplicated sense. It is presented with the same careful, precise, documentary neutrality that the Sumerians brought to their accounting records and their astronomical observations. It is noted, it is preserved, it is, in the fullest sense of the word, recorded. Before we consider what this pattern might mean, intellectual honesty requires that we acknowledge the 3 most serious ways to interpret it, because the evidence we have examined supports, to varying degrees, each of them, and the truth is that we do not currently have the tools to definitively establish which interpretation is correct. The first interpretation is the most conservative, and it belongs to the mainstream of Sumerological scholarship. On this reading, what we have been tracing is a pattern in Sumerian mythology that served specific ideological functions. The creation stories in the Atrahasis and Enki and Ninmah positioned human existence within a theological framework that explained both human capability and human limitation. The Inanna texts celebrated a goddess whose complexity modelled the full range of human experience. The legal codes served royal legitimation alongside genuine administrative function. The laments processed collective grief and maintained community cohesion through formalised ritual expression. The assembly scenes in Gilgamesh and Arga preserved historical memory of specific political events. On this reading, the pattern we have identified is real, but primarily reflects the internal logic of Sumerian religious and political thought rather than any systematic observation about human nature. The Sumerians were sophisticated thinkers, and their literature is rich and multi-layered, but we should be cautious about extracting a unified philosophy from texts that served multiple, complex, contextually specific functions. This interpretation has the most institutional support and deserves to be taken seriously as the baseline against which other readings are evaluated. It has the advantage of methodological conservatism. It does not ask the texts to mean more than they can be shown to have meant in their specific cultural and historical contexts. The second interpretation occupies a middle position that some scholars have found productive, reading the Sumerian literary corpus as encoding psychological and philosophical wisdom in mythological form. On this reading, the recurring pattern of resistance to complete control is a Sumerian understanding of human psychology and empirical observation drawn from long experience of actual human communities, that certain qualities of mind and spirit are inherent in the human makeup and cannot be entirely suppressed by external authority without destroying the capacity that makes the person valuable in the first place. The Atrahasis epic's creation sequence on this reading is not merely theological cosmogony, but an encoded observation that you cannot build a being capable of complex labour and judgment without also building into them the capacity for autonomous response, that the atemu in the clay was not an accident but a necessity, and its consequences were understood at some level from the beginning. This interpretation gains support from the remarkable consistency of the pattern across genres that served very different functions. The wisdom literature of Shuruppak makes no theological argument about divine creation, yet it transmits the same emphasis on independent judgment. The legal codes, written for administrative purposes, embed the same structural protection for individual claims against superior authority. If the pattern were merely a feature of religious mythology, we would not expect to find it embedded with equal consistency in legal and wisdom traditions that served entirely different purposes. The third interpretation is the most speculative, and it requires the most careful handling, because it is the interpretation that moves furthest beyond what the text can be demonstrated to support, and into the territory of what they might suggest if taken as records from the Sumerian perspective rather than as mythology. On this reading, the Sumerian texts are preserving, in the form available to them, something like a historical memory of actual events in which the relationship between human beings and the authorities that claimed governance over them was not an abstract theological question, but a lived reality, and in which the consistent pattern of human resistance to complete control was not a theoretical observation, but a documented experience. The texts on this reading are not constructing a philosophy, they are recording a fact. The difficulty with the third interpretation is obvious. It requires us to take seriously the Sumerian perspective that the events described in the texts, the creation of humans by divine beings, the Ajigi rebellion, the flood as a divine decision, were understood by the Sumerians as history, rather than mythology, and to at least consider the implications of that understanding without dismissing it reflexively. Most modern scholars are not comfortable doing this, for methodological reasons that are sound. The boundary between historical memory and mythological elaboration is genuinely difficult to establish for any ancient culture, and Sumer is no exception. What all three interpretations share, however, is the acknowledgement that the pattern itself is real. The Sumerians recorded across their literature a consistent observation about the difficulty of complete human governance. They did not seem to find this observation troubling or subversive. They preserved it in their royal literature, their wisdom traditions, their legal codes, and their laments with equal care. They seem, in some way, to have considered it a feature of the record that needed to be maintained. The three interpretations disagree about what the Sumerians thought this observation meant. They do not disagree that the Sumerians made it. There is one more observation worth making in this synthesizing moment, and it concerns the figure who appears at crucial junctures throughout nearly all of these texts, Enki, the god of wisdom and deep water, the keeper of the Abzu, the craftsman of divine intelligence. Enki is present at the creation of humans, incorporating divine substance into the clay. He warns the Asudra against the flood. He sends the me into Inanna's custody. He provides the means of Inanna's resurrection from the underworld. He is consistently positioned across the corpus as the agent who intervenes on the side of human survival and capability at moments when other divine authorities are pressing in the opposite direction. Enki is also consistently described as the god of wisdom, of practical, applied, situated intelligence, the kind that understands the actual nature of a situation rather than simply the formal rules governing it. And what Enki consistently demonstrates in his interventions on behalf of the human or quasi-human figures in these narratives is a preference for the preservation of capability over the enforcement of control. Whether this reflects a specific theological position, a remembered pattern of events, or a Sumerian observation about the relationship between intelligence and governance, it is consistent enough across the corpus to constitute a genuine feature of the record. Something in the Sumerian understanding of the relationship between wisdom and authority seems to have preferred the preservation of human capacity, even complicated, ungovernable, divinely disturbing human capacity, over its elimination. They wrote that preference down in multiple genres across multiple centuries. They kept the clay, what the tablets leave unanswered. Come back for a moment to the room in the British Museum where tablet BM 78941 rests. It is not on public display in the way that larger, more visually dramatic artefacts are displayed. It sits in the holdings of the Department of the Middle East, in the custody of scholars and conservators who understand its significance and who have spent careers learning to read the marks pressed into its surface more than 3,500 years ago. 25 centimetres of clay, 19 centimetres wide, the bottom half of a 3-part story, its surface damaged, its text interrupted in places by the patient erosion of time, but enough remaining to read the word that bothered Enlil, Rigmu, the noise that could not be quieted. We do not know with any certainty what the Sumerians believed that word ultimately described. The scholars who have spent lifetimes with the text give answers that range from demographic pressure to autonomous human vitality to something in between, and they are right to stop short of certainty, because the text does not provide it. The clay preserves the question without resolving it. It seems almost as if whoever composed the atrahasis epic understood that the question was not the kind that resolves. What we do know, from the full spread of the Sumerian record, is that the observation was not isolated. The Atemu mixed into the clay of the atrahasis creation, the being in Enki and Ninmah that defeated the system of categorization. Inanna standing naked in the court of the dead, still looking with the look of death. The me distributed into the city, the troubled heart, the forthright speech, the art of strife, the descent to the underworld, the assembly in Uruk saying no, Shuruppak giving his son a mind rather than a rulebook, Enheduanna writing from exile, the man with 1 shekel pointing to the clay, the laments preserving the memory of cities that burned. Across all of this, across every genre and every century of Sumerian literary production, the same shape keeps appearing, quietly, without editorial comment, without drawing its own conclusions. The record keeps noting that something about certain human beings, or certain divine beings, or certain qualities that the two share, resists complete formalization, resists complete suppression, persists through plague, drought, famine, flood, exile, institutional displacement, and catastrophic destruction. The 3 ways of reading this pattern are all available to you, as they were available throughout this investigation. The text might be encoding a sophisticated mythology that served specific theological and political functions. They might be preserving an empirical observation about human psychology dressed in the language of divine narrative. They might be something closer to historical record, a documentation from the Sumerian perspective of the actual relationship between human beings and the authorities that claimed governance over them. The tablets do not tell you which reading is correct, neither does this voice. The clay was precise about what it recorded and deliberately silent about what it concluded. What can be said, with the careful confidence that evidence supports, is this: the oldest civilization that left written records used those records to document, again and again, the same observation, that among the beings who fill the world, there are some who carry within them something that governing authority, even divine governing authority, has historically found it difficult, perhaps impossible, to fully manage. The Sumerians found this observation worth preserving. They pressed it into clay, they fired the clay, they carried it through the flood. Wherever you are tonight, in whatever quiet or noise surrounds you, the tablets have said what they have to say. The question they leave you with is the same one they left to every scribe who copied them, every scholar who translated them, every person who sat in the museum, silence, and looked at the marks and wondered what they meant. You have heard the evidence. The pattern is there in the clay, across the centuries, consistent and unresolved, and quietly extraordinary. What you make of it belongs entirely to you. Let the question rest now. Let it settle into whatever part of the mind keeps things worth keeping. The Euphrates still runs roughly where it ran when the first city rose on its banks. The clay is still there. The marks are still legible for those who learn to read them. And somewhere in the British Museum, in the custody of people who understand what they are holding, the tablet waits with its surface chipped and its edges worn, and the word at its centre as clear as it was the morning the scribe pressed the reed into wet clay and decided that the noise of. Humanity was something worth writing down. Sleep well. The record keeps.